And on the back of this imperialist blackmail, this imperialist form of the debt and so on, you also get the encouragement of war. A war caused sometimes by the direct intervention of imperialism, most famously in the case of Somalia, where the American task force supposedly came to save people from starvation. Warlords that had previously existed in Somalia. A real warlord, a warlord that could bestride the globe and had nuclear weapons behind it if necessary. And during the American intervention in Somalia, capable of shooting down thousands of ordinary Somali people, and all it managed to unite people was behind the warlords that previously they'd begun to break from in the interest of a greater democracy inside Somalia, pulled them behind those people who led Somalia nowhere. Direct, real neo-colonialism in the case of Somalia, but also the encouragement of other wars. Why was there such an awful genocide in Rwanda? Why did about 800,000 people die in 1994 in Rwanda? Because of the poverty, the scapegoating encouraged by various international agencies, by the fact that the ruling class in Rwanda was following the lessons that it itself learned from how ruling classes act in other parts of the world. That's, they learn from looking at other parts of the world how to act. Why is there a war in Eritrea and Ethiopia? You can't say there's any direct American influence over resources and so on that's going on there. But in Eritrea and Ethiopia, ruling classes are acting as they see the Russian ruling class act in Chechnya, as they see NATO act in Yugoslavia, that imperialism creates a society where all across the globe, not just in the great imperialist nations, all across the globe, the first act of ruling classes is to reach for the gun, to feel that you can achieve a transformation of society in their interest through militarism and through the change of the society in that way. I want to finish in the last 5 minutes by talking about the other side of this reality, which is to say that the suffering is very real. I mean, people sometimes say, oh, we shouldn't talk about Africans as victims. We shouldn't talk about, and of course, to talk about Africans simply as victims is ridiculous. But let's not ignore the scale of human suffering that's going on in Africa at the moment. The scale of human suffering is incredible. And also, let's be clear about who's responsible. Responsibility lies in the capitalist world system, the World Bank and the IMF, with the giant corporations, with imperialism. That's the reality of why Africa is as it is at the moment. But it's also important to talk about the hope. And the hope is not the British paras arriving in Sierra Leone, or the Americans arriving in Somalia, or the French arriving in Central African Republic. This is not the hope. Capitalism offers no future for these people. No future at all for society as it is at the moment. On the basis of capitalist development, Africa is going to vacillate between total collapse and acceptable levels of starvation, acceptable levels of 50% dying through AIDS, acceptable levels of horror and poverty. Acceptable to whom? Acceptable to the pinstripe boys in the markets in London, to the White House, to number 10 Downing Street. For them it's acceptable. Africa as it is at the moment causes them no tears, causes them no worry. They are not worried by the fact that Africa suffers as it is at the moment. On the basis of capitalist development, this is the reality for Africans. A little bit worse, a little bit better. It makes no difference to the reality for the majority of people. The real hope is the fact there has always been resistance in Africa. If you look at the resistance against colonialism, for many decades, people fought back against colonialism. The fact that the British were defeated twice in the 1824 and 1860s by the Ashanti people. That the British were beaten by the Zulu at Isandlwana in 1879. The fact that Al-Hajj Umar and Abd al-Qadir, the two great in the Sudan and in Algeria, defeated the invading armies of the French and of other imperialist nations for some 25 years, and eventually a third of the French army had to be sent to Algeria in order to colonise Algeria. That period of resistance, but also in the modern world, the period of resistance against neoliberalism, against the structural adjustment programme, which is because, first of all, that it was the workers' movement that was absolutely crucial in defeating apartheid, that it was the workers' movement that pulled down the structures of racism, of institutionalised racism inside South Africa. This was the key element in preventing apartheid continuing. That if you look at Zimbabwe, it's the development of the workers' movement from the middle of the 1990s, which has pulled behind it more and more people, students, people who work in markets, not market people, you know what I mean anyway, market people, the unemployed, the youth, pulled behind the workers' movement in Zimbabwe the development of something which can challenge not simply Mugabe, but the whole of that society be run on the lines of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In Nigeria, in many ways a crucial country in Africa, population of about 110 million people, you see the oil workers' strikes in 1996, which were the beginning of the process of what passes for democratization in Nigeria. You see earlier this year a general strike in Nigeria against Obasanjo, the new government, which had been arrived with such hope for many more people. And today, hundreds of thousands of civil servants on strike in Nigeria. For what? For the minimum wage. Something that, echoes across the world for so many sorts of workers. You see in Kenya a series of strikes by teachers and other groups of workers. We've seen general strikes in places like Niger, the beginnings of resistance again in the Ivory Coast. That this is the central element that is offering real hope to Africa. And it's interesting that when you talk to people from Africa, how many of them talk about Seattle as a crucial part of what has been encouraging people and inspiring people. That, people in Zimbabwe spoke about how wonderful it was to see in Seattle, in the heart of the capitalist beast, people rising up against the system. Someone said to me, well, if people there are fighting against capitalism, why should we have the World Bank imposing it upon us? And the feeling there of there is a world changing, there is a world turning, there is the beginnings of a possibility of a break from the tears and the agony and the suffering in Africa. But it can only come about on a force which bases itself and says, here are the resources of the world, here are the people who need it, how are we going to match them together? Not through the mechanism and the mediation of profit and a small group of people who drag it away from us, but through the mediation of ordinary people themselves, beginning to determine how those resources are used. And it would say that there's going to be a socialist revolution in the next 5 years in Africa. It would be ridiculous to put that forward. But how much things have changed. How much things have changed, the beginning of a sense that in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in many other countries, you have the beginnings of a workers' movement which is discussing not simply democratization. I mean, people have been through this in Africa. At the end of the 1980s, a whole series of one-party states collapsed. But not simply talking about democratization, but talking about economic freedom, talking about taking power from the multinationals. And that has a long way to go. But as part, when we feel ourselves as part of that global movement of workers fighting against the system here, it's also true that there is an army of people in Africa that is not prepared to let their continent be smashed by their own ruling class or by the multinationals and the World Bank. The people who want to fight against that system, want to fight for a better world. And that's the only real hope for Africa.